Hey everyone, the movie that I watched was Enron, the smartest guys in the room, and I wanted to briefly go over my presentation and a couple points of analysis that I had on the film. So jumping straight into it, a brief overview of what the film goes over. It is about the company Enron, and the beginning of the background is focused mostly on Enron's founder, Ken Lay, and a lot of his childhood. It shows his humble beginnings and how fairly early on he had a goal to build a large and powerful organization. I think that the phrasing used was that he saw something to the effect of the potential for business. And the film proceeds on for a while, and what occurs is that some of the Enron traders are making some pretty aggressive bets, and when they pay off and are later discovered by Ken Lay, he ends up encouraging the traders to continue doing what they were doing, and he essentially tells them to keep making the firm lots of money. As the film progresses, we get deeper and deeper into Enron's story. He begins to recruit visionary type employees that have a radically different approach and places them at very powerful positions in the company. And he encourages them to make culture changes to the company and utilize a different type of accounting known as mark-to-market, which becomes particularly important as we get into some of the unethical activities that Enron takes part in. And some of these culture shifts, just to spend a little bit of time going over those. One of the higher-ups at Enron that Lay had hired was a pretty big believer in social Darwinism, and part of his philosophy was to fire a pretty large percentage of the workforce each year based on performance ratings. And he also had encouraged employees to put all of their personal savings, all of their retirement into Enron stock, and he created a obsession with the stock price day in, day out. And very quickly, on mark-to-market accounting, it is simply allowing the firm to record the profit of a new deal or a new venture immediately rather than when the profit occurs. And what ends up happening is that Enron inflates its own stock for a number of years. It gets looked at deeper and then goes bankrupt. And because all of the employees were pushed as part of the company culture to put their life savings into Enron stock, they end up being left destitute in many cases without any sort of appreciable assets, and having just been fired from a company involved in a massive scandal. So their work history as well becomes a black mark on their past, and it ended up leaving a lot of people in a bad situation. So the film itself did a great job of covering the events, which were quite complex due to the detailed nature of a lot of the different things that Enron did and the processes that they followed. And the film made it very easy to follow and understand. The film does a pretty good job of leaving the events to be interpreted by the viewer and making sure that the viewer, when presented with all the facts, gets to make their own conclusion and judgment about what occurs. And they do this pretty consistently throughout the film, particularly on what Enron has done in and of itself. But moving in to the criticisms that I have of it, there's a couple things that they didn't do so well, particularly with regard to letting the viewer come to their own conclusion with the facts that are presented. So my first complaint about the film is that the human interest side of the story was pushed and, in my opinion, sensationalized above the facts of what occurred. the vices of the various executives were given quite a bit of focus, and the personal philosophies of many of the executives were also given a lot of focus. And understanding that for the general audience, this is a long, boring movie about a business that is fairly in-depth, I understand why the filmmakers did it. However, I believe that it does take part in an attempt to demonize corporate executives in general, particularly those that work at profitable companies. And fairly early on in the story, I sense a strong political opinion being pushed by the narrator and writer about deregulation in the energy sector being at fault for Enron's actions. And there's a bit of an internal contradiction in this when one considers that the Enron executives are all portrayed as very greedy people that take advantage of situations. And because of that, I found it a bit strange that there was such a focus on the deregulation being the problem here, when it's also abundantly clear that the mark-to-market accounting is what made a lot of what Enron did possible. Luckily, however, this message isn't carried through to the end of the film, and it didn't impact my enjoyment of it overall. But in giving the film fair consideration, those are the complaints I have. Really, anything that stepped outside of trying to better tell the story of what occurred at Enron and how it occurred. So there's a number of lessons for entrepreneurs in this film, but bringing it down to just a few, the largest lesson that I believe that one can take is that value has to be provided at every step, and understanding that Enron being able to inflate their own value quite literally in terms of their stock price was at fault for a lot of the problems that they caused. I still believe that a good lesson can be taken for an entrepreneur in focusing on increasing value with growth. So the conclusion for the entrepreneur, any growth that occurs in your company should be met with a proportional increase in value, and that being the value provided by your company, because otherwise at some point there is a fabrication of your company's value. And moving on to some of the takeaways for business in general, greed can't be a driving factor in a business decision because it steps outside of objectivity in terms of good decision making by prioritizing money right now. And going into this in a bit more detail, many of the higher-ups at Enron cashed in on opportunities to liquidate their stock, and they ended up not considering the long-term consequences of this business strategy, particularly when it came to their employees that helped them to build this empire. In one particularly egregious case, one of the executives actually formed shell companies to hide the debt that Enron was taking on through them, and then he would later on make sure that he had his ownership stake in that company that they had formed strictly to do business with Enron, essentially allowing him to double dip and generate his own profits from the firm Enron. And in addition to this, from the business takeaway side of things, the personnel management strategies that Enron utilized that were based around cutting the lowest percentage of employees, while it sounds good on paper by continually improving the performance of the company, the real world result was that it incentivized employees to behave unethically to move themselves to the top and to tear down their fellow employees in order to reduce competition. So I think that a decent lesson that can be learned from this is to determine what the performance standards are and keep employees that are able to consistently meet the performance standard, and if they exceed it, then additional compensation and reward can be given. But incentivizing the employees that are performing less to perform better than other people, even if they're meeting the standard of making their presence worth Enron's investment, then it ultimately caused problems for Enron when they ended up firing these people because of the illegal activity that it made encouraged. And as this is all going on, the stock price of Enron continually goes up. These employees continually put their money into it, but they don't have the insider knowledge that the executives at Enron have. So in many cases, instead of coming away with a large payday, they ended up poor after the bankruptcy had been declared, because reporters had begun looking into Enron. So, in short, from the business takeaways, ethical behavior wins the day. Providing value ensures that any business doesn't end up in a similar situation to Enron, and short-term opportunities with long-term costs are not worth taking, and better personnel management strategies than simply cutting the lowest performers are necessary for a sustainable company.